Hello, good evening. Welcome to People's University, the struggle for women's rights. We'll get started with our third class here in just a minute. I have a few announcements to make first. First of all, next week on the struggle for women's rights, we will talk about suffragists in Wheeling, and the professors will be Judy Hendrickson and Jean Finstein, whom you all know very well. And that will be next week, and you'll be able to win this fabulous toiletry bag, Votes for Women. Yay. This evening, you'll be able to win. And the way you win is by asking a relevant question or making a relevant comment. We'll draw the names for people to do that after the session's over. And you can win a stemless wine glass. This one is Marie Curie. There's one other, you get a pair. Or you could win 3 passes to the Heinz History Center, nice, which are generously donated by Bob Stakely and the History Center. So we'll draw for those as well. And while I'm on the subject, this Tuesday at noon, Phil Greenwalt will be with us to talk about the Revolutionary War, the battles of Lexington and Concord, about which he has written. He's a graduate of Wheeling Jesuit University, and during that program, we're giving away a lot of stuff. But check this out. This is a new made by East Wheeling Clay Works, hand-thrown lunch with books soup mug that also works very well as a coffee mug, I have found. So we'll do the same thing on Tuesday. We have a couple dozen of those to give away over the course of the next few weeks. I want to mention also one more thing, bear with me, that this Saturday is the 4th Ruther Pollock Labor History Symposium, Solidarity Against Hate, as you can see. We wanted to keep that tradition going, and we're going to do it virtually. So it starts at 11 a.m. on Saturday, and we hope you can join us for that. It will be dedicated, just one more thing here, to our friend, you will remember from last year that she sang, Elaine Perky, who died yesterday after a battle with COVID-19. And she is a great voice, was a great voice for coal miners in West Virginia. Her husband, you see in the picture with her, was a coal miner, retired. And we are going to miss her. Elaine Perky, we will donate the program to her on Saturday. We will dedicate, sorry. Now, this evening, Jerra Jenrette is with us, and she's going to tell you about some of the founding mothers. She is professor of history, retired, I understand, at Edinboro, University of Pennsylvania. And like I said, she's going to tell us all about the founding mothers. So I'm going to hand it over to her now. Here is Jerra Jenrette.
Good evening, everybody. I am excited to be with you. I remember very fondly my visit with you a couple of years ago in the summer for the World War II series. I thoroughly enjoyed talking with all of you and spending that time with you. And I want to begin, before I begin, I just want to offer my condolences to all of you for the loss of your friend and loved one yesterday. It's deeply saddening to see how many of us are being affected by COVID-19. So with that said, let's talk about some founding mothers. And so if we can begin with the slides, Sean, that would be great. Okay, so this is just the first one. I just put a collage together, and we're going to just go ahead and move through that. These are some of the women that we'll be talking about. So we can just go ahead to the next slide, which is really the title slide, Founding Mothers. And I picked some women. Well, Sean specifically asked me to talk about some of these women, but I added a few on my own. And we're going to be talking about Pocahontas and Adams and Phyllis Wheatley, Deborah Sampson, Mercy Otis Warren, Esther Reed, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Sybil Ludington, and maybe others. Next slide, please. I would ask that you all think about Our mothers. Let's think about our mothers for a few minutes. My mother used to say to me, well, I really haven't done anything. I just stayed home and took care of the house and worked in the field and took care of the children. And unfortunately, in our history, we really haven't given much attention to the mothers in our history, and it's time that we correct that. Our mothers, our founding mothers, our mothers have always been present. Let's talk about for a minute, what is a mother? Next slide, please. What is a mother? Webster says that a mother is a female parent, a woman in authority, someone who has maternal affection or tenderness, or something that is considered an extreme example of its kind in terms of scale. For example, you will often hear people say the mother of all ships. Next slide. I found this little graphic that I thought was kind of neat. The mother is, you are my voice of reason, a storyteller, advice giver. I'm not going to read all of those. Teacher, psychologist. I always like to think of mothers, particularly if they cook like mine did, as chemist, because of the knowledge that was required, particularly in colonial America, for women to be engaged in cooking, as it was a dangerous experience many times, because it was very easy for them to, for their dresses to get caught in the embers around the fireplace. And so I give you some of our founding mothers, and some of them may be women that you might not have thought about as founding mothers. So let's begin with one of the first women that many people talk about. Next slide, please. Pocahontas.
Jerra, let me pause for a moment, because we're having a problem with the orientation.
Okay.
I'm going to take the screen share down. Just give us a second.
And okay, sure.
Okay, we're ready. Sorry about.
Oh yeah, that's much better. So everybody knows about Pocahontas, and I have on some of these slides, I have a lot of text, and I'm not going to read all of these bulleted items. I just want to talk a little bit about maybe some things that maybe we don't know about her. She was not called Pocahontas early on. Amanute was her birth name. Some people think that she was called Pocahontas because that means playful one, and she apparently was a very happy child. She was the daughter of the chief, Powhatan, and really probably had more benefits, more luxuries than her peers because of who she was. We all know the story of John Smith, who claimed that she saved his life. A lot of historians have debated his accounts of their encounters. Some in more recent years have raised lots of questions about any encounter between them, because when they met, she was about 12 years old. Next slide. She did marry another person from her tribe in 1610. And she had become fully aware that it was not particularly safe for her to be around the English very much. So she avoided them a great deal until around 1613. And she was lured onto an English ship and kidnapped during what is known as the First Anglo-Powhatan War. During her imprisonment, it is when she meets widower and tobacco planter John Rolfe. This is actually who she really marries. Not John Smith, but John Rolfe. John Rolfe was a dedicated Christian. So some have asked questions about whether or not he might have struggled with the idea of marrying someone of a different religious persuasion. Pocahontas did not live to be very old. She is taken to England, where she dies at age 22. Next slide, please. Abigail Adams, a very familiar image in American history, somebody that, a name that easily rolls off of anybody's lips. Adams lived from around 1744 to 1818. So before we go any further, I'm going to ask Sean to play this short video entitled, Who Was She? This is under a minute.
Sorry about the technical problem. So maybe if we do a screen share for the video instead of the PowerPoint, it'll work. But right now I'm only seeing the PowerPoint. Yeah, I'm sorry. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to some of these videos. I am terribly sorry. We're having technical difficulties.
That's no problem. They're not necessary.
Let's
I
proceed with
thought
the
they would just compliment, so that's fine.
Now we have video and no sound. We might just have to go back to the PowerPoint.
I think let's just skip the video, Sean, because we don't want this to slow us down that much. And if, like you said, if we have time at the end, we will look at some of them.
Okay.
Okay, so Abigail Adams, that video actually refers to her and John Adams as the first power couple. We're on slide 8. So a lot of people they know about John Adams' impact on early America. He was an early Federalist. He becomes our second president. But where was he for much of their life during the 1770s and 80s and beyond? Well, John was not around a great deal because he was often working away from home. He was in the capital. He was in London. And so there was a period of their life where she was taking care of their farm, their business. And in some of their early letters, she will write to him and refer to the farm as his and the business as his. But eventually what she does is she changes the pronoun and she starts talking about, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. She starts saying in her letter, she starts referring to the farm as ours, not just his. And so I think that's a really important distinction to note about her, that even though she is a 17th century Puritan woman, she is beginning to recognize her contribution, not just a mother and a wife, but as somebody who's engaged in their business, engaged in keeping it running. Often people refer to her famous statement. We'll get to that a little bit later, called "Remember the Ladies." But if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about their letters. And this is from the front cover of the book. Their letters have been collected, and Edith Gellis, who is senior scholar at Stanford, has collected and published those letters. They've been published in many forms now, and there are hundreds. Some that Gellis published for the first time and you can see their names: John Adams, John Quincy, their son, Jefferson, Mercy Otis Warren, the Madisons, and Martha Washington, among others. Also, John Adams. And Abigail writes to her husband and to their friends. The Warren family are important friends of theirs, so we will come back to that. The video link at the bottom, we're not going to play it, but I just want to tell you that this is from a multi-part series called Adams. It's about John Adams and his life, their lives together. I encourage you to rent that if you have not seen it and watch it. Next slide. So one of the interesting things about Abigail Adams is that here she is in the 1700s when Jefferson and Franklin and others are drafting the Constitution. She begins to raise questions about Christianity and slavery. And I think this is a really powerful statement that she makes. I have sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs. So in other words, how can you call yourself a Christian and hold slaves? She says this, I am certain that it is not founded upon that generous and Christian principle of doing to others as we would that others should do unto us. And I have the reference down at the bottom. It's from a letter dated March 31st. Her most famous statement, which I said, is called Remember the Ladies. Next slide. So this is quite long, and I'm not going to read it all, but I'll just note that this is from the same letter where she is talking to John about the issue of slavery. It is in March of 1776, before, of course, July the 4th of 1776, and she says to him, you know, I'm excited. I'm anxious to hear that you have declared independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws that you write, I desire you would remember the ladies. Be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And she goes on to talk about why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity. Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection and in imitation of the Supreme Being. Make use of that power only for her happiness, for our happiness. Next slide, please. So these are images that this is actually the letter that she wrote. You can't read it. I can't read it this small. If you had a large printout, you could make out some of the words. But these are copies of the letter that she wrote to him on this date in March. So John's response I've always found quite interesting. And if we were face to face, I would ask you, well, what do you think his response was? How do you think he might respond to this very bold statement from his wife in the 18th century? I'll give you a minute to think about that. How would he respond? How might he respond? How would you respond? Well, John says basically this. He writes to her and he's very complimentary, and he says, I've heard of this group and that tribe complaining about their rights, but never before have I heard of the tribe of women complaining about their rights. He chuckled. He laughed. He laughed at her comments, but then he goes on to say, I think you shine as a stateswoman and a Christian. Now, we all know what a statesman is, and we know that we really don't have very many of those anymore in our country. We used to have people that were considered statesmen, not necessarily not people who have been elected to political office, but people who have political influence and use that for the good of the nation. And so by calling her a stateswoman, he is acknowledging her intellect, and her Christian faith. Next slide, please. Later on, this is 1793, she writes to him and she says, and 1793, we're a new nation. The Constitution's been ratified. The first 10 amendments have been ratified. Washington is president. And she says in a letter, she said, my mind is much occupied with the affairs of our country. If as a female I may be called an idol, I never can be an uninterested spectator, end quote. She could not be an uninterested spectator. So when you think about the idea that during this period, women were to be seen and not heard, and particularly with politics, because politics was considered dirty and corrupt. So women, proper women, were not supposed to be involved in that. And so this is her feeling towards the end of the century. Next slide. A contemporary, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley lived a very short life. She was, in fact, brought to the American colonies when she was very young. She was about 9 years old. She was brought on a slave ship named Phyllis. Thus, the family that purchased her, John and Susanna Wheatley, named her Phyllis, so Phyllis Wheatley. Yet John and Susanna Wheatley were perhaps a rare type of slave owner. They certainly believed in slavery because they owned a slave, but they also wanted her to be educated. So their children tutored her, as did they. And by the age of 12, Phyllis Wheatley was reading both Greek and Latin and reading very difficult passages from the scripture. By the age of 14, she had begun to write poetry. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of the Old South Meeting House in Boston, a fairly recent photograph, and that is where Phyllis Wheatley went to church. So you see, at that time, there was, in this location, not a, quote, a black church and a white church. Phyllis Wheatley went to church at the Old South Meeting House. Now, Phyllis Wheatley was quite sickly at times, and there was a suggestion by the doctor that it would be wise perhaps to take her to see. The son was going to London on business, and so the family agrees for her to accompany the son. So she goes to London looking for someone to publish more of her work, as she ends up meeting prominent people there, including the Countess of Huntingdon, Selina Hastings, who became very supportive of her. And she did publish poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in London. This brought fame and praise to her on both sides of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. Shortly after Phyllis Wheatley published, and this is an image from one of those publications, the Wheatleys did emancipate her. But neither one of them, John nor Susanna, lived very long, and it wasn't long before Phyllis Wheatley fell into poverty. She did marry. She did marry a man who was a black grocer, John Peters, but they struggled financially, and she dies at the young age of 31. One of the interesting things about her that we do know from the work of Paula Giddings, historian who writes about Black women's experiences. The book is entitled When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America. Paula Giddings writes about the fact that Phyllis Wheatley actually met with George Washington at his request. They met for about 30 minutes. Giddings asked the question, wonder what the country's most famous slave and the most famous slave owner had to talk about. Well, we don't know. What we do know, according to Giddings, is that not too long after that meeting, Washington gave the order to conscript blacks into the Continental Army. This was something that the British had already been doing. The British would offer freedom to blacks who did in fact sign up with the British and agree to serve in the British Army. Now, we know that the British didn't win, so it's not clear whether those individuals got their freedom. But Washington decided that it might be important for the Continentals to do the same thing. And so we do know that there were Black men who served in the Continental Army. We can go to the next slide. Deborah Sampson is kind of one of my favorite women in history to talk about. And this is obviously a statue of Deborah Sampson, and the other two are the covers of books, one for children, more for children, and then one for adult age about her life. She's called America's First Woman Warrior. She was, in fact, we can go to the next slide, a Massachusetts woman who decided that she wanted to do more than stay at home, more than be in a support role. So she will disguise herself as a man, enlist in the Continental Army, and serve for about 2 years before her true identity is uncovered. She's one of a very small number of women with a documented record of military combat experience in that war. Next slide, please. Again, a long slide, so I'm not going to read all this. So she enlists as a guy named Robert Shirtliff with a Massachusetts regiment, and is involved in scouting and involved in a raid, and she will end up eventually wounded a couple of times. And she, according to the record, she was at Yorktown. And like I said, a couple of wounds. She actually dug the bullet out herself, because if she had gone to the hospital tent, then they would have certainly found out that she was not a man. However, she does get sick and is taken to the hospital. She's some epidemic that was going through, and it is there that her identity is uncovered. And I always used to say to my students, can you imagine what that doctor thought when, alas, he found out, doctor, that Robert was not Robert, but was in fact Deborah. She was given an honorable discharge, received a military pension from the state of Massachusetts. She will die at age 66 in 1827, and her husband will receive her pension. A couple of other things before we move to the next slide about her is that during this time where she's dressing up as a man, and what she's also doing is, of course, going to taverns, and this becomes known to some people. And so her church, people in her church didn't like this. They accused her of not being a Christian because she was, quote, wearing men's clothing. And they did plan to actually excommunicate her from her church up in Massachusetts. But the other thing that I think is important that is not on the slide is that she may well be, maybe not the first, because I actually don't like that, the first, but one of the first women to actually go on a lecture circuit. So around 1800, 1802, she was actually traveling around parts of New England talking about her war experiences. That's pretty amazing, I think. Let's move to the next slide. Mercy Otis Warren. So what is on the left of the screen is the front page of a book that she wrote. It's a multi-volume book entitled The History of the Rise, Progress of the American Revolution, which she writes after the war is over. But during the war, Mercy Otis Warren, next slide please, comes from a prominent family. Her father is James Otis Sr. Her brother is James Otis Jr. They are both attorneys. During the years leading up to the Stamp Act, which is in 1765, and then later the Boston Massacre and other events leading to the Revolution, there is a tremendous conflict between the Warren family and Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson was a merchant. James Otis Jr. and Sr. were both attorneys. James Otis Sr. had been promised the position of Chief Justice of the colony. That position, however, was given to Thomas Hutchinson. So this really upset the Warren family, because what that did was that kind of became pivotal for Hutchinson, because he became Chief Justice, then he became Lieutenant Governor, then he became Governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, whereas the Otis family were kind of, cast aside in a way. So James Otis Jr., her brother, some would refer to him as, he was kind of in the school with Sam Adams. Sam Adams has often been referred to as the firebrand of the American Revolution. And James Otis Jr., as early as 1761, was arguing that the only way to resolve the conflict with Great Britain is revolution. So what happens is that Mercy Otis Warren begins to write. She begins to write satirical plays that highlight the ongoing conflict with the crown. And I've just listed three of them for you. The Defeat, the Blockheads. The Blockheads is actually about when, after the Boston Tea Party, and the British decide to blockade Boston Harbor, because all of this action has been going on in Boston. And so the Brits send troops, and they're going to blockade the harbor. And so she writes The Blockheads, about British soldiers, and The Adulator, which is a play about Thomas Hutchinson, whom she despised. And in her play, she never actually uses Hutchinson's name. She recalls him Rapatio. Now, the root of this is, it's rapacious is really where this word comes from, which means greed. And so she was really casting aspersions upon his character. These plays were never acted out on stage, but they were read by most people. Anyone who was literate read them. Those who were not literate, it was read to them, because there was an organization of women called the Daughters of Liberty, active during this time, and they had reading circles where they would read newspapers to the illiterate. They read things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And so, you have everybody in Boston and in the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony who is familiar with these writings. And so we have this woman who is engaging in political action. Next slide, please. Mercy Otis Warren writes about her feelings. She sends a letter to John Adams, and I don't have it in front of me, but I'll just share with you essentially the idea of it. She writes to John, and she says to him, "If I, as a woman, engage in political writing about these male leaders, will I not suffer? Is this not wrong of me to do this?" His reply was this: "Madam, not only do you have an obligation to write because God has given you this talent, which he gives to very few of the human race, not only would it be a crime to neglect it, but it would be a sin." So this is in the 1770s when she is writing about the British, and not in a very positive way. Okay, so keep that in mind. So then along comes, the war ends in 1783. We have the Articles of Confederation that govern us. They don't work. And so Madison and others set out to draft a constitution. And so as soon as that document is completed and submitted to the states in 1787 for ratification, there is an immediate opposition. Those who supported the Constitution were called Federalists. Those who opposed it, of course, were called Anti-Federalists. Well, the Anti-Feds' concerns were, number one, that this was a document that was drafted in secrecy, because they didn't even tell people they were meeting, just the delegates that were meeting. They didn't tell it. They were essentially, they argued, trying to recreate monarchy in America, because if you look at the structure that was laid out in the Constitution, we have a president, you got a king, you got a house of, you got a House of Representatives, and you got a House of Commons, and you got a Senate, you got a House of Lords. So there were some similarities that concerned them. The main issue was the lack of a Bill of Rights. And so the interesting thing here is that John and Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren and her husband James Warren were on opposite sides. The Warrens were anti-Federalists. Now, these people were really good friends, the Adams family and the Warren family. So in her History of the American Revolution, which comes much later, around 1800, she actually writes that John Adams had betrayed the principles of the American Revolution in supporting that Federalist document. Well, if you know your history, you know that Madison quickly responded to the criticisms by the anti-Federalists and drafted the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is what most of us think about when we think about our constitutional rights, the right to speech, the right to press, the right of religion, and so forth. John Adams responded to what Mercy Otis Warren wrote, and he says this, Madam, and this is almost a direct quote, not precisely, Madam, when the war ended, your subject was complete. History is not the province of ladies. So chew on that. As long as she was writing, criticizing the British, he was happy about it. But once he criticized her, he was no longer happy about it. Next slide. This is a person that if we were in a face-to-face situation, I'd ask you how many of you have heard of her. Most people haven't. Sybil Ludington, who was a 16-year-old who basically did the same thing that Paul Revere did. Right? In April of 1777, of course, Paul Revere's ride was a couple years early, along with William Dawes. She rode all night on horseback to warn towns in Putnam County, New York, and Danbury, Connecticut, that the British were on their way. So she, as a 16-year-old girl, gave that early warning to many, many people. And so I think she's someone that, we ought to remember quite often. So next slide. So many of you probably know Esther Reed. She was British, but she sided with the American revolutionaries because she believed in freedom. And she wanted to prove that women were the political equals of men. And so to do that, she wrote quite a bit. She published her work. She was able to garner female support because she is pushing for patriotism. And so she will organize about 39 women in Philadelphia. They were referred to initially as the Ladies of Philadelphia to help her. So they establish the Ladies Association of Philadelphia to provide aid to the troops for General Washington. These women went door to door and raised about $300,000. She wanted to give it directly to the troops, but General Washington was concerned that the money would be wasted on alcohol. So he actually asked her to make clothing instead. Next slide. So they did. They used their money, the money that they had collected, to purchase linen and sewed over 2,000 shirts. Women in the other colonies copied her example, and they began their own organizations for military relief. Unfortunately, she did not live to see the final product of her work or the women that she inspired. She died in 1780. This is early, of course. The war is still raging. But she left her work to be taken over by the daughter of Benjamin Franklin, Sarah Franklin Bach. Pretty impressive resume, I would say. That's quite a large sum of money that they collected at that time, $300,000. Many of us would say that's a lot of money right now. Next slide, please. So here's another unknown. Her name was Phoebe Francis. there's a great little video. Hopefully you can see it on your own. It's from a guy who dresses in period costume. He identifies as the folklorist, and he talks about what she did. But here's her story. Her father owned a tavern in New York City, not too far from General Washington's headquarters. And of course, a lot of people go in a tavern, and she was serving in the tavern. And so there was a British soldier, and his last name was Hickey. And so he came with the British troops, but after he had been here for a while, he let on that he was siding with the Continentals, and he was actually a spy. And so he met Phoebe Francis in this tavern. He frequented it, and he really took an interest in her. And so he began to talk to her about a plot to kill General Washington, to assassinate him. So he asked her if she would take poison and put it in General Washington's peas when he came in for dinner the next night. And so the plan was Hickey was going to be there. Phoebe Francis was going to feed General Washington the peas, and he would die. There we would be without our commanding general of the Continental Army. Well, Phoebe Francis told her father what Hickey had said to her. Her father told the Continentals, and when Washington came in the next night, he did not eat the peas. He threw them outside, according to one source at least. Threw them out to some chickens to see if they were in fact poisoned. The chickens ate them and they died, and Hickey was arrested and was executed, and may well be the first military execution in this country. Next slide, please. Eliza Lucas Pinckney hails from South Carolina. In case you're all wondering, I'm originally from North Carolina. And so I kind of have an affinity for Eliza Lucas Pinckney. She is from the Low Country, and her papers are housed in the South Carolina State Historical Society, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. So Eliza Lucas Pinckney really changes agriculture in South Carolina because her father owns plantations in the Low Country, but they also have plantations in the Caribbean where they find indigo, and they bring indigo to South Carolina, and it becomes a chief crop on all the plantations that she was responsible for managing, which was 3. And so indigo becomes a great cash crop in the Low Country in the 18th century. In case you're wondering, she is mother to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was a South Carolina politician who ran for vice president and ended up in the high upper echelons of government at one point. She also believed in the idea of Republican motherhood, which was the notion that mothers were supposed to train their sons to be good Christians and patriots, and to imbue in them that notion, that sense of standing for our country, defending our country, but also doing it in a Christian way. Next slide. So I don't know how many of you are Hamilton fans. I have become one. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Not somebody that I ever talked much about in any of my classes, but the Hamilton, the Broadway play, really got me more interested in it. And so she was born into the wealthy Schuyler family in New York. She actually went with her father when she was very young to meet with the Six Nations, the Iroquois, who Benjamin Franklin also visited them. And many have argued that part of our early government was modeled after the Iroquois Confederation of Nations. The Iroquois, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and so forth. She does marry Alexander Hamilton. And after his death, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, she becomes she remains very active. So next slide, please. During his life, she would serve as an intermediary between him and his publisher, for the Federalist Papers. You know that he was one of the co-authors of that. And she will continue defending his legacy and organizing his papers for publication after his death. Most notably, really, what she did was to become involved in concerned about children who were orphaned. If you know Hamilton's story, you know that he was orphaned at a young age, comes to this country as an immigrant, is looked down upon by many, like Burr, and even Jefferson was not a fan of him, nor was Adams. But Washington recognized his genius and put him in as first Secretary of Treasury. And so she will help establish the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children. She will also establish, this is bullet number 4, the Orphan Asylum Society, and becomes the director of that. She serves in that role for 27 years. She will raise funds, collect goods, and oversee the care of children, some 700 children. By the time she left, she had been with the organization for 42 years. Now, not too many people have that kind of longevity. This organization continues to exist, but under another name. Her work has led to her induction into the philanthropy section of the National Museum of American History. So that's Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, or Elizabeth. Next slide. I didn't feel that I could close this out without talking about 2 other women that I think were very important in the next century, because I don't believe that it was a one and done deal. You know, the idea of the founding of the nation. We are, and have been called by many, the American experiment. We are a work in progress. And so Sojourner Truth was, in fact, a former slave who will eventually be able to earn her emancipation. She becomes involved in the abolitionist movement of the 1800s. She becomes involved in the women's rights movement of the 1800s. And in 1851, she gives a speech at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, where she says, you know, you say women need to have the best place everywhere, but nobody ever gives me the best place everywhere. And ain't I a woman? I have plowed and planted and gathered as much as any man, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne the lash and seen 13 children sold off into slavery. And ain't I a woman? Nobody ever lifts me over mud puddles or helps me into carriages. And ain't I a woman? And she says, that man in black back there, pointing to a minister in the group, he says women can't have as many rights. Women can't have as many rights as men because God wasn't a woman. She kind of puts all of her physicalness into what she says, and she says, well, where did your God come from? From Jesus and a woman. Man had nothing to do with it. She becomes a very prolific speaker on the abolitionist and women's rights circuit, not without being heckled and you know, harassed. Of course, that happened. One of the most interesting things for me about her is I always call her the Rosa Parks of the 19th century. And we all know what Rosa Parks did in 1955, okay? But in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ended, she was in Washington, D.C., attempting to desegregate the public transportation system there, the streetcars. Almost 100 years before we even knew about Rosa Parks, or before Rosa Parks was taking action in Alabama. So there are lots of great renditions of different people reading this speech from her. Cicely Tyson has done one. Kerry Washington, if you know those names, have done readings of that. And so they're all quite good. In fact, Cicely Tyson did one for the Obama White House way back a few years ago. It was a celebration of Sojourner Truth's life. And so finally, I'd like to conclude with one of the important women that I believe contributed to the founding of this nation to help us identify who we are as a people and in terms of what we aspire to be. Next slide, please. And that's Harriet Tubman. And who doesn't know about Harriet Tubman? You know her story. If you have not seen the movie Harriet, and the link is the trailer from that movie, I would encourage you all to watch it. It is a really excellent movie. The actress, whose name escapes me right now, did an incredible job portraying her. And what we do know about her is that she escapes from slavery and does not stay in the comfort of the North, but makes multiple trips, some 19 trips and more, back to the South to lead people to their freedom. One of the most dangerous things about this action on her part was not only that if she was caught, she would probably be killed, but when she was in slavery, her master got mad at her one time and he threw something at her and it hit her in the head, and it caused her to black out at the time. And after that, she had spells where she would just black out, faint. A lot of people today have argued that maybe that was epilepsy that she was experiencing. But so that could happen to her anytime when she was wading across the rivers to try to lead people to freedom in the North. It could happen to her. The great thing about her, and she says, I was determined I would have liberty or death. I was not going to be taken. I was not going back to slavery. Next slide, please. So these are images from Auburn, New York, which is where I live, which is just south of Erie, Pennsylvania. It's roughly about a 4.5 hour drive from here. It's just off of I-90 as you drive across the Finger Lakes in New York. And this is the Harriet Tubman home. Obviously some pictures of her and one with her husband, but on the bottom right, the white frame house, that was actually a school where kids came in and they were taught there. The brick building up in the right top was the Harriet Tubman home for the old elderly, the aged is what it was called. So what she did was to welcome former slaves. The one-story brick building, and thank you for that. Cynthia Erivo played Harriet Tubman. I appreciate you saying that. Thanks. The brick building, one-story brick building in the background there in the bottom left is, it's actually a museum. And so they have a nice exhibit in there about Harriet Tubman's life. They have a nice timeline with different exhibits. So I would encourage you to go there. I've taken students to this place in Auburn, New York, a number of times. Actually, the whole trip encompasses going to Rochester and to the Susan B. Anthony home and to the Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, where both Anthony and Frederick Douglass are buried. And then we go down to Seneca Falls, New York, which is where the first Women's Rights Convention was held, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house is there, and the Women's Rights Visitor Center and the National Women's Hall of Fame. So Auburn is about 45 minutes from Seneca Falls. And when I first started taking students to this location, it was completely run and operated by the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, I should specify, in that community. It is now a joint effort because this site has become part of the National Park Service. So you go there, you can get your passport stamped. So anyway, to just wrap this up, because I know our time is close. If we could do the last slide, please, Sean. So just some questions. Where would we be without the women of our lives? Where would we be without Phyllis Wheatley, without Phoebe Francis, who saved George Washington's life? Where would we be without those women who fought, who organized boycotts, who worked to feed soldiers and families, who took care of farms and business? while their husbands and fathers are away, who wrote, who read newspapers to the illiterate, who died, who escaped from slavery, who fought for the rights of others, and above all, loved their families, the nation, and its people. And when I think about the concept of mother, I think about my own mother. And she was a founding mother for me because she and her life and the way she taught me and trained me helped shape me into who I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we do have some questions, so I'm going to put them up on the screen for you.
Okay. I'll try to answer them. I won't promise.
Let's start with this one.
Who, in my view, was the most important woman in North Carolina? Not a question I expected. Well, you know, for me, I think it would be hard to identify a particular woman. The one that comes to my mind, well, not one, but the group would be the Edenton ladies, who organized a tea party before the Boston Tea Party happened, who refused to buy British tea. So do you have an idea? Who was that? That
was Bonnie.
Okay, Bonnie. Does Bonnie have any name she wants to share?
While we wait for Bonnie, let's put another question up here.
Why do I think this information has been pushed down in history? You really want me to answer that? I guess so.
Yes.
I think it is because historically, women in this country were property. Women did not get to make their own choices. And quite often, I think women themselves don't recognize their own contributions. You know, the people who are taught to think about posterity are the wealthy, right? They're the ones that keep their records. They're the ones that, you know, they keep diaries. I think of Queen Elizabeth II. You know, she's been writing in her diary for decades. You know, so she is writing for posterity because, you know, yes, it's probably something that brings comfort to her, but she probably also knows that somebody's going to read that eventually. And so I think that women often do not do themselves any favors. I think, as I mentioned, my mother's generation would often say, well, I remember one time I said to my mother, I said, I want to interview you. You know, I'm requiring my students in my women's history class to interview their mothers. So I want to interview you because I want to find out more about your life. And her first response was, well, why? I haven't done anything. And I'm like thinking, okay, this woman got married at 16 years old. My father was 20. They were married for 65 years, raised 4 children, had a small farm. He was a minister. She worked on the farm just like he did. They ran a small grocery store for 8 years and they still had the farm. And when she went home, she had to do the cooking. Mm-hmm. So I think she did a lot. And she taught me the value of education, even though she was not very educated. And so I think that's part of it. But I also think in some cases, there are deliberate attempts to exclude women's stories. There's a book called A Midwife's Tale. And it is a diary by a woman named Martha Ballard. Martha Ballard lived in the late 18th century. She was a Revolutionary War era person before, during, and after in New England. And she was a midwife. So she kept a diary for 26 years. So when this diary was uncovered and shared with some male historians, their response was, well, it doesn't really contain anything. All she talks about is the weather. Well, another historian later on, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who coined the phrase, well-behaved women rarely make history, Ulrich took that diary and dissected it up one way and across. She created charts and looked at issues that Martha Ballard talked about. And what you get in that diary, A Midwife's Tale, is a look at life in colonial New England in the late 18th century. She talks about politics. She talks about the economy. She talks about social issues. She talks about personal issues. She talks about rape. She talks about domestic violence. So I think that those historians were absolutely wrong. There's a great deal to learn from that. And women and everybody, I believe, really should write their own stories. We all should keep journals of our lives so that it's preserved for posterity. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but that's the short version, okay?
A couple people have asked, Pocahontas died so young. What killed Pocahontas?
It was disease, and I don't remember off the top of my head what kind it was, but it was a disease.
Okay. Here's another.
She got sick and she never really recovered from it. The answer to that question is no. We do not know why he requested to meet her. We can make some assumptions since she was a published poet. And, the Wheatley family was a rather well-to-do family in Massachusetts. And so having their support, not just financially, but, making sure she was educated, sending her to London. I wish I knew why he wanted to meet with her. I would assume to talk about her poetry. Paula Giddings thinks they talked about more, but she doesn't have any historical evidence for because their conversation was between them, and it wasn't a very long one.
Okay, here's Bonnie's answer to your question earlier. I'll put it up.
Well, Bonnie, that's a great question. And, I'm sad to say I have not done nearly as much research on North Carolina as I should, because I have lived up here for so long that my research has really focused mostly on local history. And I did do some work a couple of years ago and had a chapter published in a book about North Carolina during World War II. And I did women from North Carolina on the war front, not World War II, World War I. But that's about the limit of my research about North Carolina women. I'm sorry to say. There were women involved in the settlement house movement. There are some Black women involved in the settlement house movement. But thanks for asking that question, and thanks for prodding me. I'm going to have to rectify that.
Here's a question from our instructor next week, Jean.
Oh, that's a good question. Dolly Madison. Well, I could answer that, but what do you think?
What do you think, Jean? Bonnie says Pocahontas died of tuberculosis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bonnie.
Probably right, Bonnie.
See, that's not fair. I've got my little phone here, but I can't be rude to all of you and start looking those things up. So I appreciate you adding that. That's great.
Okay, here's another question. This from Aaron. That's actually a comment, I suppose.
Yeah, that is that's really disturbing. And it's true. And, a lot of times archives sometimes archives and libraries, especially with digitizing stuff, they go through things and some things get discarded that, we never know the value of what is being lost. When I was doing my dissertation research on women in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the textile industry over in Martinsburg, which is over in the Eastern Panhandle, well, of course you all know where it is. What am I talking about? I drove over there one day, just driving through. I was with a friend, and we had been actually to North Carolina, and we came back up through D.C., and then I said, let's go through Martinsburg just so I can just go there. I was still working on research. And I drove by one of the factories, and it had been purchased by someone. And I pulled into the parking lot, and you could see like the back where the loading docks were. And they had these huge barrels, or not barrels, but like for trash, the dumpsters, and they were throwing records into those dumpsters and burning them. I almost had a heart attack. And I went in and I begged him to stop, and he was like, this is worthless. And he let me take what I could carry in my car. So unfortunately, lots of women's records, if they keep them, are not often preserved because, in part, because it's what do we value? What do we value in our society? Do we want to hear women writing about politics, or do we want to hear men writing about politics?
Here's Jean's answer to your question.
Well, the one thing that I would say about her, I guess it depends on what we value, and I'm sure she did a lot more. But the one thing that comes up about her, Jean, is that she is one of the ones to make some significant changes and designing the interior of the White House. Because remember, it was burned, and so there's a restoration that goes on. So she was very involved in that.
Okay, here's probably our final question, and then we'll let you off the hook and we'll do our drawing.
Okay.
This is a long one, so it's going to block our faces.
Would it be accurate to say that women naturally gained experience in many skills that men were expected to demonstrate just through the conditions of their lives? Mothers, housekeepers, agronomists, chemists, stretching the resources given to them to maintain the home, as well as organizing of church groups, ladies' aid societies, sewing circles, organizing large social and community events, etc. Well, I can answer that in a word. Yes. I mean, one of the things that often happens, of course, in American history, I think about the Lowell Mill Girls. The first large group of textile mill workers were female. Ranging from age 15 to about 35. And one of the reasons why employers wanted them, why factory owners wanted them, was because they already had the skills they needed to work in those textile mills. And so they took advantage of that, even though they paid them a much lower wage than they paid men who worked in those mills. And I think that, I was helping my older sister. About 2 years ago, I guess it was, she had worked for most of her life in a doctor's office, but she had also worked in a restaurant. And she had a bout with cancer. And so she went through 7 months of chemotherapy, during which time she could not work. So she had retired just before that from the doctor's office. But she was still working part-time in this restaurant, working as a hostess. Okay. And so when she was ready to go back to work, they didn't want her. They told her, I'm sorry, we're afraid you're going to fall because your bones have been weakened by the chemo. So I was trying to help her work on a resume, to apply life experience and think about the skills that as women we acquire through life. And if you are a mother and you run a household, and of course today a lot more men run households than in the past, but if you are the primary person in the household, think about the kind of skills that you acquire. The unfortunate thing is that women don't get paid for those skills if they're using them in a job, doing the same job that a man is doing, for the most part. Yes, there are exceptions. And yes, a lot depends on race and ethnicity, and lots of times geography too. My sister was a public school teacher for many years in North Carolina, and she lived in Brunswick County down on the coast. And the school teachers in Wake County, which is where Raleigh is, the state capital, made more than teachers in Brunswick County because they got county supplements that were higher than any that Brunswick County was giving. So I don't know if I've answered that question, but you certainly have given me a lot to think about. And I appreciate all of your questions and appreciate your time. And I really wish we were face to face.
I know. We're going to have you back when we can be.
That'd be wonderful.
You'll have us, because we're very sorry about how the videos did.
Oh, that's okay. You feel free if you want to share the PowerPoint with everyone, and then they can watch those videos on their own time.
I'll definitely share all the video links, and then they can go to YouTube and watch them. And
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, let's do something fun. And we only have a few entries, but let's draw, because one of our questioners is not eligible. But we're going to draw for, first of all, for the wine glasses. Ready? The winner is Gene Finstein. Yay! Now we'll draw for the Heinz History Passes. And the winner is Elizabeth Taylor Bierke, if I'm saying that right. He's a good friend of the great patron and is always supporting our programs. Both of them are, and I guess Jean technically is an instructor, but she doesn't work for us, so she can win. And thank you all. Remember, next week, Wheeling, Suffragists of Wheeling with Gene Finstein and Judy Hendrickson. And Tuesday, Lexington and Concord at Lunch with Books live stream at noon. Jerra, thank you very much.
Thank you. I was happy to be here.
All right. And thanks for everyone who attended, and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.